Happy Halloween, everybody! Well, actually, it's mid-September for me, but I'm trying to get ahead of things. So on Halloween last year, I found myself covering Manhunt, Rockstar Games' 2003 stealth action snuff film simulator. A decent stealth game, ruined by becoming a subpar third-person shooter in the back half of the game, and I didn't find that the novelty of the game's brutality really carried the experience for me. With that said, despite not particularly enjoying myself, I believe that games and media like it have the right to exist because outside of anything illegal, everyone should be able to express themselves, even if their vision is grotesque or upsetting. With that said, no creative expression is above criticism. That's kind of where I planted my flag with Manhunt. I didn't think it was particularly good, but I'm glad it exists. But with that said, in my discussion of whether or not the first Manhunt game takes the brutality too far, or whether or not the content was too disturbing, a lot of people were quick to tell me that Manhunt 2 is way more brutal and way more unnerving, so it's sequelitis time. And while I already came to my conclusions about edgy content in media last year, let's see if people are correct in that Manhunt takes it a step further. Now, before I played this game, I knew very little about it. I played it for all of 10 minutes ages ago, and outside of that little sampling, I knew only a few things about Manhunt 2. Broadly speaking, I knew about the twist. I knew that this game was set in the same universe as the first Manhunt, and therefore in the same universe as the 3D GTA games, but had no connection to the story of the previous Manhunt. I knew the non-flashback portions were set in either 2007 or 2012, making this the final game in the universe that it was set, and I knew it was one of the first major AAA video games to get released to get the dreaded adult-only rating, hence the devs having to censor their own work. But that's it. It's fitting, however, that we cover this on Halloween because initially Manhunt 2 released on October 29th, 2007, and it was developed by 4 separate divisions of Rockstar Games. First Rockstar Vienna, but they were shut down, then the newly established Rockstar London took over as the main developer, while Rockstar Toronto worked on the Wii port, and Rockstar Leeds worked on the PSP port. So clearly this was not a priority project, especially considering that they were developing on what was the cheapest and least powerful consoles on the market at that point, including one console that was last gen and one that might as well have been because the Wii was a glorified GameCube with a much worse controller. So they probably weren't banking on this being the second coming of San Andreas. The game starts out in medias res, as before you even start the game, there's a big prison break at the psych ward. Right from the beginning, there's some pretty disturbing things going on. People being beaten, nurses getting choked, people getting injected with unknown substances. It's certainly a game that unnerves right from the beginning, but the main point is you are Daniel Lamb, and you and your companion Leo Casper have to break out of the asylum. As the game started out, I thought the game was going to be somewhat predictable based on a few factors. I mean, first of all, you're in an insane asylum, so you're clearly nuts, but then you also have to take into account that your companion Leo only seems to show up for story cutscenes. Then you have the full names Daniel Lamb, as in a lamb to the slaughter, and your companion Leo Casper, as in Casper the friendly ghost, as in he's not real. Following which, you find yourself at the mercy of a faceless group of people working for an organization called The Project. So I went through the first couple levels thinking, okay, so Daniel's insane, Leo isn't real, and all these people working for The Project were simply a full tactile hallucinatory vision of the orderlies chasing down Daniel, and all these various things happening in the story are simply his mind trying to make sense of the situation through the filter of his insanity. You know, like the whole world is out to get me, and here's why. Kinda like the movie Sucker Punch. But that's not actually what happened. The game actually surprised me pleasantly in this case. You see, at one point I started to smell a fish when Daniel started to interact with other characters, and they actually seemingly knew what was going on, including one female scientist who was taken aback that he actually talked to Leo.
You've spoken to Leo?
Without Leo, I wouldn't even be here.
Okay, you told me to give you this. The old safe house.
Like, okay, is this person a hallucination too? A hallucination that reasserts the reality that Daniel's living in? Or does this go deeper? Then shortly after that, you have a flashback regarding another scientist, and the questions kept piling up. Is this a false memory? Was this guy ever real? Is the corporation hunting them down another figment of Daniel's imagination to try and reconcile why all these people are coming after him? Well, the answer to all of this actually surprised and impressed me. They made it seem like they were going one direction and went a completely different direction. As it turns out, Daniel was a scientist working on something called the Pikmin Project. not to be confused with Pikmin. There's a whole 2 distinct letters. Well, the Pikmin project was a government-sponsored project to create a perfect assassin. How they accomplished this is they developed a brain implant which contains the neurological aspects of a perfect assassin. So when the implant is activated, your personality would be overwritten temporarily with a skilled, trained assassin. Then once it switched off, you would revert to normal and have no memory of what happened. That way you couldn't be interrogated. But back in 2001, right as a major breakthrough is taking place, government funding is cut. And so to save the project, Daniel, who was working on the project, volunteers himself to be a test subject, but the implant malfunctions, causing the 2 personalities to coexist simultaneously, giving him a bad case of dissociative identity disorder. So Leo indeed does not exist, but everything else does, and after the malfunction, Leo's personality suppresses Daniel's in hopes of permanently deleting Daniel, doing so by destroying all his worldly connections, killing members of the project, destroying records of Daniel himself, and even killing Daniel's wife. But he was eventually caught, stopped, and put into the asylum while the remaining members of the project studied him and tried to fix him, which is where everything comes full circle. Manhunt really surprised me in this case because it's the perfect type of subversion, where a simple premise begets an execution and explanation that goes 8 ways wacky. And every time you think you have it figured out, they swerve you again. And it's one of those gradually unraveled mysteries that makes you want to go through after it's all said and done and really examine all the finer points. To examine the foreshadowing of Leo actually being the antagonist of the story, to see all the hints of Daniel being the pacifist personality of the 2, such as how Daniel vomits several times over the atrocities he's committing, or how Leo is the tutorial voice constantly telling you to kill them while they're not looking, or whatever.
You think these guys are amateurs? They'll rip you apart! You got what it takes to see this through, Danny?
Plus, I really enjoy the psychological aspects of the story. The constant visual effects, the weirdness of the world, the frequent forced sedation which makes you start to wonder where the line of real and not real is drawn. It's a game that messes with your head. It's unsettling in a way that not a lot of other games are unsettling, because blood, guts, and gore, that's all well and good. But the fear one can generate by making someone feel like they're losing their grip on reality, that's something that this game actually manages to invoke in places. Something that legitimately makes me question what I'm seeing. And it all culminates in this really weird, mind-f***y way with an internal battle between the 2 personalities where nothing is real and anything can happen. You're sitting there the entire time wondering when the other shoe is gonna drop. It's not an actively scary game, but it's one of those stories that kinda sticks with you and makes you feel weird after the fact. Like, true story, right after I beat the game, I started writing the script for the video, but my screen flickered in a weird way. I damn near shat myself, because I was still on edge from the ride. It's a really cool story, but I think it would have been better served in a less wantonly brutal game. And here we go, this is the part where all the fans of the game get mad. Here's the thing, guys, I like the story of the game, but I feel like the game's tone clashes with itself. Say what you will about the first game, and I certainly have, but if there's one thing the first game did really well, it was justify its subject matter. You were a death row inmate, so you were no stranger to doing and seeing horrible things. The game was set in a dilapidated Rust Belt city, so things are barely functioning at best, not functioning at all at worst. And the whole thing was for the amusement of a snuff film director, so it makes sense that you would be expected to perform certain tasks in the most brutal way possible. They put a lot of effort into making it seem legit, but in this case, not so much. I feel like the devs saw the type of reputation that the first Manhunt had and wanted to try and double down on it. Like, yeah, the first Manhunt was edgy and pushed boundaries, so they decided to put a lot of incredibly adult things in this game, just without the prerequisite of justification. Like how at one point you have to chase down a female scientist working for the project, and she's in a secret underground base. It's unclear if the project runs the base, they're a little bit vague about that.
You know this place, the project recruited here. They preyed on people, made them disappear, we shouldn't be here.
But either way, the base is a gentleman's club for no discernible reason, and the underground is a sex dungeon where they're also carving people up. Possibly as part of the project, trying to make people quote-unquote disappear. But the reason, or this entire operation's functions, are not said and are left vague. The fact that this is so unrealistic and so generally weird is partially what made me believe that this was all in Daniel's head at first. Originally, I was going to complain about how the Pikmin project was about to be shut down when Daniel volunteered to get the implants, so how does it make sense that the project is still going? But as it turns out, I believe the project is this entire branch of the US government, while the Pikmin project was a single project within the project. The naming only confuses matters. But still, is there any reason it had to be a sex dungeon other than edginess? I mean, Starkweather owned most of the environments you were in the first game, so if there was something edgy there, well, he's a freak, so it makes sense. And then this gentleman's club is housed next door to an adult movie theater where they take control away from you and make you watch the movie that's playing for a really uncomfortably long time. Once again, what's the point? Then later, you have to go to this brothel. There's nothing special about this place, it's just some random place where adults go to do their business, but it's filled with a bunch of weapon-toting psychos who will kill you at the drop of a hat. And as you walk through this brothel, there's all these weirdly horrible things happening. There's a random room where somebody's being tortured for no discernible reason, at least I think that's what's happening. Oh, that's not what's happening. Sure sounds like it though. There's dead people and body parts strewn throughout. It feels like we stumbled upon a sub-story of something going on in this building, completely disconnected from the main story. Is this building run by the project? If so, why? And if that's the case, why would they have a base of operation in a residential building? And more to the point, why would they have all this gore hanging around? Meanwhile, if they don't run this brothel, and this is just how things usually are, well, that just raises further questions. Then again, this game is set in Louisiana, so maybe this is just representative of their average residential building. All this violence, brutality, and sexual theming doesn't feel like it's a natural part of the story. It feels like it's just thrown in there for the sake of itself because Manhunt is expected to have some level of this sort of thing. I feel like it detracts from the genuinely good writing. It also confuses the story that they're attempting to tell. Don't you think it's a bit tonally iffy that the project is presented as the main villain for most of the game, but then the twist reveal is that Leo himself is the main villain, and yet the project is still actively either doing a bunch of horrible things or are at least working with people who are? Shouldn't the point of a twist villain be that the person you thought was the villain initially is completely innocent? These people are obviously still doing a lot of horrible things, they're just not the villain in the case of Daniel and Leo. Or is it a lesser of two evils sort of thing? Like, hey, we may be evil, but we can also help you. And the tonal iffiness aside, insisting on including mature themes like this also leaves me with some questions. Like the female scientist, Judy I think her name was. She was just hanging out in a sex dungeon and then later on hanging out in a brothel? My main question is, why? It's never fully clear if either of these places are run by the project or what their function for the project would have been, but if they are run by the project, why? And if they aren't run by the project, why is she there? If these were more natural locations for her character, like an actual laboratory and then an apartment complex where she lives and she's being protected by the project, this would make more sense. But lol, they had to include edginess for edginess' sake. Either way, the story as a whole is mature in the traditional sense, whereas the content of the game is mature in the not mature at all sense. Like, in what way is the story supposed to justify the inclusion of the 3-tier execution system like the first game did? Violence for the sake of survival, sure, but the over-the-top violence that this game includes just doesn't feel like an extension of the story. It's shoehorned at best. Speaking of, as far as the violence was concerned, I was curious to know if this was a game that earned its adult-only rating, or if it was a case of Rockstar Games being under increased scrutiny. You see, by this point, Rockstar Games had cemented their reputation as the boundary pushers in the gaming industry. And while that meant that their games were basically guaranteed to succeed, it also meant they were put under a hectic spotlight. By this point, they had been fighting lawsuits centered around the contents of their games for more than half a decade. And at this point, they were under the biggest microscope they were ever under, due to the fallout of the hot coffee controversy. I'm reminded of a story I heard about the Friday the 13th movie series. That was a series that was built on the foundation of pushing the limits of good taste, to the point where the MPAA would gradually start inflicting harsher and harsher censorship on them to get them to a workable age rating, to the point where the movie Jason Takes Manhattan had basically no gore whatsoever. Meanwhile, other movies were getting away with a lot more because they weren't the ones with all the media exposure. So my point is, did this game earn the age rating behind all these obscuring screens, or is this a Jason Takes Manhattan situation? Thankfully, with the way the game censored the executions, it means I don't have to put that much effort into censoring them myself like I did last year. I'll still do a little bit of extra work just in case, but it's not as dire. Now, of course, if you know anything about this game, you probably know that the censorship didn't end with simply obscuring the violence. They also retooled aspects of the game, certain executions were changed outright. There were some gameplay features like decapitations which were all but removed. Random pedestrians were also removed as to make all the NPCs in the game inherently hostile. And this one actually caught me once because I thought this one guy in this one level was a friendly NPC, so I tried to simply get past him in order to move on. But then he attacked me, so egg on my face. And the last feature was the removal of the rating system in-game. So the game was pretty butchered in some ways because of these forced changes. Still, with that in mind, to answer my question about whether or not this game deserved the scrutiny it got, it kinda rides the line. The gameplay is pretty much identical to the gameplay of the first game. It's a linear level-by-level stealth-based game where you're pretty much given no capacity to defend yourself hand-to-hand. So instead, they encourage you to go around the environment finding various things that can be used as weapons. Mostly a series of household objects, although in this case they do give you a lot of time to play around with a spiked baseball bat, which is definitely not a household object for me anymore. Though I remember one time back in elementary school, we were visiting a police museum as a field trip, and they were showing us a wall of confiscated weapons from high school students. And one of them was a baseball bat with nails sticking out. Turns out the kid who brought it to school had no intention of actually using it. He just brought it to school because it looked cool. But anyways, regardless of which weapon you use, each one still has the same feature they had in the first game, the ability to do one of 3 separate executions. If you stay in the shadows and wait until you have a chance to get behind an enemy, you can charge up the attack, which will dictate which level of execution you do. As a result, a good portion of this game is staying in the shadows, tapping the wall to lure a guard over, and as soon as they turn their back, you brain them with whatever you have to hand. Essentially, the brutality of these executions is the reward you get for playing the game well, and the subjective quality of the game will entirely depend on how much that can carry the experience for you. But the game does encourage you to do stealth kills in that you actually get a bit of health back if you do, which is extremely useful in some of the more difficult levels. Personally, as compelling as it can be to watch a gruesome bit of hyperviolence, it's not something that really appeals to me to such an extent that it can be the selling point. And they don't do a good job at encouraging the elevated executions. The first game encouraged you to perform the elevated version of these executions because it would grade you at the end of every level. Depending on how brutal you were, you'd get extra points. Manhunt 2, meanwhile, thanks to the forced censorship and the removal of the planned rating system, means that there's no way to reward you for it. Or that's what I thought. Instead of giving you extra rewards and whatnot like the first game did, you can actually unlock the game's bad ending if you go out of your way to be as brutal as possible. In this case, you play through an alternate version of the game's final level, except through the perspective of Leo permanently dealing with Daniel instead of the other way around. It's neat that they made this a secret option, but I'm just saying they could have also included extra bonus content based on how brutal you were like the first game did, even without explicitly telling you how well you're doing. Though much like how the rewards you can get for playing the first game are only available if you play through the game on hard mode because you can't earn the requisite amount of stars on normal mode, this ending is only available in hard mode, which means on normal mode the executions are still really only done for their own sake. But you know, the same thing is true for the first game as well, so it's really just a case of reshuffling the deck, but that doesn't mean that only having the bad ending is enough. Either way, the executions have meaning on hard mode, but not on normal mode. I'm not saying it ruins the game, but I wish it could have been different. But despite the lack of rewards, and while this game can be a touch repetitive, there is a layer of tension to the gameplay as you're sneaking from point to point trying not to be seen or heard, and to get close enough to lure your victims over to kill them. And getting caught and having to book it leads to exciting getaway sequences where you're praying to get around a corner and find a hiding spot before they catch you. Tension really is the word here. Though the stealth gameplay doesn't have as much variety as the last time, it feels comparatively streamlined. Last time I felt like they went out of their way to encourage different momentary strategies. For example, luring guards over to different areas with throwable items in order to separate groups, and I feel that wasn't really a thing here. I mean, you can do it, but it's never necessary. and I think that's partially due to the fact that it's rare that you'll attract more than one enemy when getting their attention. As such, splintering the groups doesn't really come up that much, but in streamlining the game, they also got rid of some of the chaff. Like, they got rid of those horrible escort quests and de-emphasized the hand-to-hand combat. The hand-to-hand combat is as awful as it was before, and also just as hazardous, given that most enemies can take pretty much the same amount of punishment as you. And as a result, it's equal odds if you'll survive a hand-to-hand combat encounter. It always felt in the first game like the hand-to-hand combat was a punishment for screwing up the stealth. Even when you were forced to do it at times, it still felt like the game was punishing you because the mechanics were not particularly enjoyable, and not particularly survivable. And as such, they did the best thing they could have done in this case by actually making the hand-to-hand combat a punishment in that it's never forced on you, and it's also not fun to do. So your best recourse is to run away and find somewhere to hide and take everyone out more passively. And I approve. I think the game is more fun when it emphasizes the part of the game that it does well. Well, no shit. While I can take or leave the more brutal nature of the gameplay, I feel like there's something to the stealthy gameplay. I will fully admit to having been taken in by the moment-to-moment gameplay in this case, because I feel like there is something inherently satisfying in an impish sort of way in sneaking around in the shadows and cracking the skulls of unsuspecting people. And I found myself getting more into the action of this game than I was in the first game, and I couldn't really articulate why that's the case. Maybe it's the controls, which are definitely a lot smoother. They still make the mistake of not using the right analog stick for the camera, but there's like 100 little fixes to the general controls that makes moving around this world feel a lot better. Maybe it was also the general progression, because unlike last time, where everything was a series of challenges laid out by a giant pervert, every level in this case has a major overarching goal you're working towards to progress the story. Something that actually makes the game far more reactive than the first game, because that game felt a little bit static as far as the progression, in that it took far too long for anything to happen. They actually make you feel like there's a constant forward march of progress. Or maybe it's because I've completely lost my mind. That's entirely possible. Looking at it, it's kind of hard to know how much of the game really needed to be changed once you got the controls and structure up to par, because for what these games are, they are pretty much fully realized versions of their concept. So really, the most a game like this could do would be to staple individual gimmicks on top of the finished game, which is sort of what they ended up doing. They did add some new features, but many of them feel arbitrary, like the ability to break light fixtures in order to create shadows to hide in. I remember this coming up all of once, and if it came up after this, I didn't notice. And I feel like this is sort of a gimmick where you need to go all the way with it or not at all. Give us the ability to break all light fixtures or none of them. But only giving you the ability to break certain light fixtures, it makes this feature annoyingly trial and error to figure out which light fixtures you can and can't break, to the point where you probably just won't bother after a while. There's a new feature where you can crawl into small spaces, but it's entirely contextual. All it does is open up a few new means of level design. They also make it so now certain guards are more aware and as such will actively listen to hear you breathe, and therefore you need to hit a button or a button sequence in order to hold your breath, which adds a bit to the panicky nature of the stealth, especially because you're never quite sure when this sort of thing will come up, so you need to be quick on the draw and be hyper vigilant. They also added motion activated lights, but those barely came up and were consequential maybe never. There's also a new feature of air kills, where if you're above an enemy, you can kill them Assassin's Creed style, but this came up all of twice in the game, so once again it really adds nothing. Unlike this other feature, which was also contextual but slightly more fun, where if an enemy is standing next to a highlighted spot with a specific environmental item, you can do an environmental kill on them, which will give you a unique animation. Certainly fun for the novelty, but largely I only dealt with these environmental kills if they were more convenient than just braining them with whatever I had to hand. It's funny though, there was this one spot in the first flashback mission with this giant crusher dealie, and I kept luring people over to it one by one and pushing them in. It was hilarious. They would walk over, see the remains of their friend, and question what happened to them just long enough for me to walk up behind them and throw them in as well. It's like an R-rated Three Stooges routine. So there's not a hell of a lot that the game really introduces as far as new mechanics, core or otherwise, but with that said, the base experience is still as unique as it ever was, and I found it surprisingly enjoyable. However, this game makes the exact same mistake the first game did, in that it starts to heavily emphasize the shooting mechanics from about a third of the way through the game, which not only kills the game's uniqueness, but also the gun combat is not nearly as fun as the stealth gameplay. Sure, much like a lot of other things, the gun combat has been smoothed out somewhat. There were times in the previous game where I felt like it was basically impossible to get through certain situations because of how absolutely weak you were and how many enemies you were supposed to kill, to the point where I had to abuse the mechanics and the AI trial and error style. And the shooting controls overall just felt very stiff and awkward, so even if it wasn't obnoxiously hard, it was really dull. In this case, I think I only died a couple of times in shooting-based levels. The controls feel more conducive to a third-person shooter style of gameplay, and you get to play around with more guns this time around, so I would say the third-person shooter element of the game is better than last time, but that merely upgrades it from being completely obnoxious to being completely okay. And I still don't approve. It's not where the game's strength lies. And it only serves to make this game feel and play like every other game that exists. Thankfully though, unlike last time, instead of making the game guns, 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 and nothing more for the entire duration of the game after they're introduced, this game actually bounces back and forth between slower paced levels emphasizing the stealth and faster paced levels where you have to shoot everyone. There's even levels where they emphasize running above all else, particularly the levels where you're being chased by a helicopter. These are usually over pretty quick, but at least it adds an extra level type to the mix, and I particularly enjoy the mood of these levels where you're being chased by a million people and have no way to survive other than running. It makes you feel like a powerless lamb in the face of insurmountable odds. Hence why you need to play more like a predator. This game also emphasizes the non-combat elements slightly by adding a couple of puzzles, but they really didn't commit to it all that often. Usually, the puzzle aspect of the game is entirely down to finding the correct item, like finding a crowbar to pry something open, or finding something to open a chain link fence. Some levels are quite open, which emphasizes an exploration element, and this is especially fun if there are a lot of enemies around you you're trying to avoid. But in other cases, it can simply mean backtracking to a place 10 rooms back in the more linear levels, or in this one case, I'd get a crowbar and I had no idea where it came from. I didn't have it one moment, and I had it the next moment, but I'm not complaining. But then there are two separate instances where you have to cut someone's head off in order to get past a specific checkpoint, but that's really just a bit of faff to get from point A to point B. The game will also helpfully let you know that this is something you can do whenever it comes up. And they also build a few puzzles around the ability to pick up and drop dead bodies, which is usually pretty meh. Matter of fact, the final boss is basically just this. You have to carry the mental manifestation of your dead wife over to her grave as a means of defeating Leo, all the while fighting various versions of Leo. It honestly kind of felt like an anticlimactic way to end the game. I mean, right before this, you had to out-stealth Leo, which was fun and appropriate as far as boss fights go in these games. But neither these sequences or the combat sequence in between really hold a candle to the final boss of the first game. And I was surprised to find out that this was actually the way to win. You simply beat Leo to death after burying your wife, and that's it. It felt like there should have been an extra boss phase or something, but it just ended. Though I am fully aware that there was a lot of cut content in this game. I wouldn't describe this game as rushed necessarily, because it feels like a complete experience. I did run into a couple of pretty notable glitches, like this one part where I clipped through the floor and found myself suspended in midair, and another instance where an enemy was attacking me while his bottom half was clipped into the floor and he fell through the floor once he died, which was hilarious. But it was still a mostly functional game that felt mostly complete. But it also definitely feels like they wanted to do more with this game that they simply didn't have time for, and the final boss is an example of that. But still, it is a surprisingly uplifting ending in this instance. Daniel finally defeats Leo, and he's given a completely fresh start, and whatever happens next is entirely his own destiny to make. You know, I gotta say, I know that this tends to be the game that people look more negatively upon compared to the first game, but I actually think I'm more positively disposed towards Manhunt 2 compared to the first game by the end. Maybe it's the fact that I was genuinely taken in by the psychological weirdness of the story, maybe I found the gameplay more polished and more enjoyable. Or maybe once again, I've completely lost my mind. But either way, I found this to be a rather absorbing time. Granted, it is also significantly shorter than the first game. I beat it in 6.5 hours, whereas the first game was over 10 hours, so maybe it's just a matter of getting in and getting out before the concept gets old. But either way, I enjoyed Manhunt 2 for what it was worth, even if I felt that some of the more edgy aspects of the game weren't really necessary beyond being a Manhunt game. But I guess that begs the question, was this game actually deserving of the adult-only rating when it was initially assessed by the ESRB? Was it really substantially more brutal than the first game to the point where it made sense to give it the old AO? Well, it's hard to say. I have seen the uncut version, which is widely available. Hell, it's been widely available pretty much since the game first came out because Rockstar made it no secret that the uncut version of the game was on the disc, much like how the hot coffee content was on the disc in GTA San Andreas. But it seems them being upfront about that meant that they were offered more leeway in this case. But even the uncensored version doesn't come across as substantially worse than the first game. Enough to warrant an adult-only rating? Maybe, but the fact that they had to change so much of the game in order to get it to the point of being saleable feels a bit like an overcompensation. Censoring the violence, in my opinion, probably would have been enough in any sane world. The other various changes they made? That seemed like too much to ask. So that does tell me that Rockstar Games was likely given the adult-only rating on account of being under increased scrutiny. But then again, I don't know the ESRB process, nor do I know the ESRB agent who was given the task of grading this game. Could it have been that the violence in itself wasn't necessarily the thing that gave it the adult-only rating, but rather a general overall sense of adultness to the game, and simply toning down the violence was the thing that brought the overall water level down to an acceptable point, so to speak? If that's the case, I could maybe understand. I wouldn't necessarily agree, but I would understand. So to put a pin in it, was Manhunt 2 the Jason Takes Manhattan of video games? To a point, I think it was. Not to that degree, of course, but there's no doubt in my mind that Rockstar Games was definitely a target at this point. I think if any other game developer had made this game and brought it out, it would probably still get an adult-only rating, but they would probably end up having to do far less censorship in order to get it down to an M. It's not necessarily the fact that this game had to be toned down, but more so the degree to which it had to be toned down that makes me suspect that Rockstar Games' reputation was partially what gave the game the rating it got. But still, I actually had a surprisingly good time with it. Manhunt 2 was definitely a game that had more potential than what was realized, but what was there felt like a more refined, more enjoyable version of the first game. Shame that we'll probably never see what this game could have been fully realized, nor will we probably ever see another Manhunt game. With graphics being as realistic as they are now, I doubt a game like this could ever be made. I think it would traumatize a lot of people. And I'm sure there's a question of, what about things like Mortal Kombat? Well, I feel things like Mortal Kombat are stylized and over the top enough that the violence can be seen as acceptably ridiculous, whereas a more gritty, grotty, down-to-earth style of hyperviolence mixed with realistic graphics would probably be a bit much. But as far as never seeing this type of thing ever again, I really have no strong feelings one way or the other. This concept has its novelty, but it's not such a good couple of games that I feel their absence is missed. They have their place in history, and I'm glad they exist because once again, I think all creative vision should be able to be realized, but I don't really care one way or the other to see this type of thing ever again. But that's just me. If you like this video and want to support the channel, be sure to leave a like, tell me what you think in the comment section, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the Monarch of Snark right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.